a great way to extend our energy supplies is through energy efficiency. If we are more efficient with our energy resources, then we don't need to mine as much for natural resources or burn as much wood or any of the ways that we've talked about that we can produce electricity and produce energy. So when we look at improving that energy efficiency, we see that a lot of the energy that we produce is actually wasted. Some of that's because our energy resource produces way more energy than we could possibly capture. We talked about that a little bit with nuclear power. Some of it's just the inefficiency of the technology that we've created that uses the energy. So, for example, our internal combustion engines that are in cars are not very energy efficient. And if we improve the efficiency there, then we can use more of that heat energy to actually make the car go, as opposed to it becoming that waste heat. So like if you put your hand on the hood of the car and it gets hot from the car running, that's the waste energy that's being released. And that goes back to that second law of thermodynamics, or the entropy, where the heat isn't created or destroyed, it does change forms and it does become less usable as it changes forms. So if we can reduce the amount that we lose through the waste energy, then we're going to improve our energy efficiency. And if we take that example back to cars again, then that means that our cars will get better gas mileage, essentially. So we'll be able to go further on the same amount of gas as we do now. So some things, other things, including the internal combustion engine is what I already talked about. The incandescent light bulb is the old-fashioned, like if you think about the cartoons where they have a light bulb over their head, it's those kind of light bulbs. It has a carbon monofilament that runs through it, and that's how that heats up, and that's what produces the light itself. They lose a lot of energy. Those are the, like if you can't touch a light bulb like those if they've been on, because there's a lot of heat, and that's all waste heat. So switching over to our fluorescent light bulbs or LED light bulbs reduces a lot of that energy loss due to heat. We've talked a little bit about nuclear power, and that 92%, once again, is just because we can't contain all the energy that's created when uranium splits. We just can't. We don't have that capability right now, and so a lot of it is lost through waste energy. Our coal burning power plants, you'll see that while we get a lot of energy out of coal, once again there's a lot of that that's lost through that second law of thermodynamics. Those are just some examples. So what can we do to improve our energy efficiency? Well, if we're looking at more efficient lighting, more efficient electric motors, we'll talk about a little bit later on about just the building structures themselves. Now we have the LEED certifications, the LEED certifications that are the very energy efficient buildings actually now can win awards for how energy efficient they are, but there's designations now for buildings that are built with energy efficiency in mind. So when we look at our fuel, we talked a little bit about fuel efficiency, but it's also what we make our cars out of. So when we first started making cars, we made the Model Ts. They were made out of steel, but they were still fairly lightweight. They were fairly small. But as we got into the 50s and 60s, we started to build cars that were much heavier and kind of boat-like, and they were really big. But they were all made out of metal. And so as technology increased, now you have more parts of the car that are made out of fiberglass, they're made out of plastics, which are lighter in weight, and that's why fuel efficiency has gone up. So CAFE standards are standards that the government has set to improve fuel efficiency. There was some push during the Obama administration to increase the CAFE standards. We'll kind of have to see where that goes from here at this point, but the idea was just that it became mandated, and so now all cars that's where the labeling comes from on cars, were from these standards that they had to publish and post how fuel efficient their vehicles were. You're going to be doing an activity in this week about different vehicles and is your car an Energy Star? Does it actually, is it very fuel efficient? And you'll be able to look at a couple of different kind of cars and compare and contrast their fuel efficiency. So we also have hybrid cars, which is another way to improve fuel efficiency. So they have the hybrid ones run on both gas and battery power. We also have some that are strictly battery powered, but this one here is showing you a hybrid. So the battery is there to run the electric motor. It increases the power, and it helps to like start the car in there. But it both has the combustion and the battery power in there. So this increases the fuel efficiency in the vehicles. They don't need to use as much gasoline when they have that battery. So we looked a little bit when we talked about solar heating and solar power. We looked a little bit about passive solar heating, about how we position our homes. We looked at using that light and making sure, and using like vegetation to block out some of the sun during times of year when we didn't want it. So that's a couple of ideas there. Super insulating just means that we have lots more insulation, right? Like right now, instead of just thinking about like the pink insulation that's in your walls. We'll look at some examples of that here in just a second. And then the plant covered green roofs, where they have special roofs where they make it so that you can have things that hold water on top of your roof, basically, because then they plant. So they put down soil, and then they plant grass, and it acts as insulation. And then some of it's just about, in our buildings, about making sure that we don't have gaps in our doors and windows. Replacing windows with double paned windows instead of single pane windows. Selecting appliances that are energy efficient. So they all have labels on them when you go to the store also, and just looking at those, and they have Energy Star ratings to see that you're buying something that's more energy efficient. And that's the same thing for air conditioners and heaters and hot water heaters, everything. All those kind of things have that Energy Star rating on them now. So this is an example of super insulation. It can also be done with Adobe bricks. There's lots of different ways they can do this. So in this example, instead of having the pink insulation on the outside of the wooden structure, they put a layer of plastic, and then they put the hay bales up, and then they will plaster over the top of them, and it'll be stucco, which is what you see in this final product. So it looks a lot like some of the houses we have here in Arizona. It's just that what's inside the walls is different. So some things that have come up in the past where people are concerned, they're like, well, won't it mold and mildew? Well, they make sure, first of all, that the straw is dry when they're using it, and then they have moisture barriers on either side to make sure that they doesn't mold and you don't end up with that nastiness inside of your walls. And then another concern that I've heard is, well, won't they catch on fire? The thing about bales of straw or hay or anything like that is that they don't actually burn very well. So fire requires three things in order for it to burn. It requires ignition source, which is their heat. It requires fuel, and it requires oxygen. And in this case, one of the things that's significantly reduced is that oxygen, because hay is actually compressed and packed pretty tightly together. There's no way for oxygen to actually move in between the pieces of hay in order for the fire to travel. So if this house were to catch on fire, it would actually smolder like around the edges once it got through that moisture barrier and to the hay itself. But it would take a really, really long time for the bale of hay. Like there would have to be a lot of heat that was applied to it for a long time for the straw itself to actually catch on fire. The whole inside of the house would already have to be involved in the fire before the outside of the house and the insulation portion of it caught on fire. I used to work for the Forest Service, and I was a wildland firefighter for many years. We were in Texas and we were dealing with some hay bale fires, and we had to, in order um, to do anything with it, the hay bales, mostly just the outside of them would burn. So we would just have to break apart the hay and put out the outside part of the fire of the hay bales, and then the fire would go out because it wouldn't get into the middle of it very easily. Like I said, it takes a lot of heat in order for it to get there. Here's an example of a living roof. So the house is down, you can see the windows and the doors down here. And then if you look up kind of on the top here, over in this kind of corner, you can see a little bit of the grass. So they actually built on the top of them. We talked about this a little bit with this when we looked at solar energy, and we are talking about sod houses a little bit, and that's where this idea comes from, where the houses are kind of built into the side of the mountain, and they cut out the sod. And they put it over the top of it. So this is actually something that's been used for many years in the United States, especially during our westward expansion phase. And we've kind of moved away from that now, but it actually was a really good insulator, and especially when they didn't have access to a lot of wood, it was a good building material for them. So lastly, we look at, we're going to come back once again to that idea of filling in the gaps. So in this particular picture, the purple is the coldest area. So this is a thermal look at a building. And what you're seeing is heat. The heat is registering in colors. So purple is the coldest, followed by blue. White is the hottest, and the second hottest would be red, and then orange, and so on. So you can see that the windows are an area where a lot of energy is escaping from the building. And then you can also see, like, around the doors, all the joints and things like that is where we're losing a lot of energy. So if we can start replacing windows, and we can fill in cracks, and we can, use there's rubber bumpers and things like that for the bottoms of doors, and weather sealing and things like that, that will actually cut down on energy costs in buildings.